Or November 19th. We've got a fun show today. We're going to talk about the COVID news. And after that, some relatively breaking news about a product that many of you have heard about, the Owlet Smart Sock. Not entirely good news there, but we'll talk about that in a second. After that, our main event for today, it's episode 4 out of our series, How Do I Get a 510K? We were taken aback when we realized that it's a question a lot of people have, but have never seen a start to finish, soup to nuts walkthrough of what that process is actually like. And so today is the 4th week in that series, and I'll be joined in just a minute by Adrian Harris and Rick Routson from our team. After that, time for Q&A and announcements of events, as we always have time for. But let's go to the COVID news. We've been watching for a while, and sadly, CDC's data portal for the last few weeks has been non-existent in terms of the summaries that they have been doing for the last number of months. Their state summaries, gone, wiped from the website. So we have to turn to other sources. Let's start with some of the news, though, this from the west side of the state of Michigan. The Spectrum Health System, the number of COVID patients in their hospital jumping dramatically from about 200 at the beginning of the month to nearly 400 here by the mid to late November. Comments out of this article by Wood TV. The hospital system is seeing a positive test rate well above 20%. You may recall that we were looking at test rates around 10%, and we always thought, well, that's, if it's below 10%, things are doing pretty good. But now the hospital seeing a test rate well above 20%. Statewide, their comment, the positivity rate is 16.8% and rising. So that's a marked uptick. Of course, most of our data these days coming from covidactnow.org. Here, cases in the state of Michigan reaching levels that are the same as we saw in November, December last year, as well as April, May this year. And in terms of deaths, still lower than the previous 3 peaks, but climbing slowly upwards to both of those. Hospitalizations also nearing the high water marks that we saw previously. And in terms of ICU hospitalizations, about the same. Currently just north of 600 ICU hospitalizations in the state of Michigan. ICU capacity used continues to hover around 80%, just below or just above, but right now we're back to just above 80%. And the vaccination rate in the state just below 60%, so still not up to the 60% mark there. One more graphic here, the positive test rate, and you can see here in the last week or two that jumping dramatically up to levels that are similar to the height of positivity in April, May this year. So that's probably the most interesting indicator that we have here of things changing. How does this stack up against what we have talked about before, which is excess deaths in the state of Michigan? I'm sorry, in the U.S. While the state is seeing an uptick, we know that the country has been on a downward trajectory, but we'll see if that continues. Here's the latest from the excess deaths. Anything above that red line that you see, something that was statistically not expected and due to the pandemic. Obviously, 3 peaks there from April 20 down through January of 21. Summer was pretty calm in terms of excess deaths, really not registering. But as we got to late summer, early fall, you saw a relatively high peak. The question now, does that go back up? Does that stay? The state of Michigan certainly not being a good indicator for that. But that's where it is nationwide. Again, in terms of deaths, we're not looking here at hospitalizations or cases, but in terms of deaths. That's the COVID news. Next up, we want to talk with you about a product that you've probably heard about before, and that is the Owlet Smart Sock. Owlet's been in the news and not entirely for good reasons, so we're very sorry for what's happening here. Back in 2017, after they had been on the market, Owlet, the smart sock that tracks your baby's heart rate and other vitals, did eventually submit a 510K to the agency for their smart sock. Well, we would have hoped for good news there, but in this last month, Owlet received a warning letter that versions 1, 2, and 3, generations 1, 2, and 3 of their Smart Sock are considered medical devices, and without a 510K clearance, which apparently has not happened, they've asked them to remove them from the market. In fact, if you go to the Owlet site right now, you can't find the Smart Sock at all, although on other sites you can still find some left. FDA cites advertising on Amazon, Walmart, and Target as demonstrating the claims that Owlet has made. And unfortunately, they come down pretty hard. They say since 2016, FDA has corresponded with Owlet that the Smart Sock meets the definition of a device under the FD&C Act and doesn't fall under the compliance policy for low-risk products that promote a healthy lifestyle. You've certainly heard us talk about devices that can be used for health and wellness, and FDA is saying, sorry, Owlet, you don't fall under that. So we've talked about some things that do, but in this case, a device that already on the market has gotten removed from that category. The company decided we're health and wellness, and FDA said, no, you're not. It doesn't help that the Owlet had gotten reported into the MAUDE database for medical devices. Here's an example of a burn that happened to a baby in the vicinity of the device. So just generally not good news. What we can't tell you today is exactly why this has happened. Why have they not achieved their 510K? That's anybody's guess right now. We may know, we may never know. But it's interesting, in light of the health and wellness things that many attempt to pursue, here's a limit where that wasn't achieved, where it thought, well, we can do this, but it was too far of a reach in the FDA's eyes. Now the warning letter coming out here this last month. One more bit of local news to tell you about before we get to our main event of the day, and that, of course, is the $2,500 MedTech Crossroads Pitch Party. It's a party, not a competition, because we can't judge truly against companies in different verticals. But we like to reflect with our judges on what was good about the pitches, what was bad about the pitches, what did they like, what did they not like. And companies that are willing to send their pitch deck to pitchparty@medtechcrossroads.org can be eligible for selection into the pitch party. The PowerPoints need to have the areas of problem statement, vision, value proposition, team, milestones, business model, competitors, and the ask or the functionally equivalent areas to be eligible for consideration. Our esteemed judges, Andy Rader, Dr. Nikki Kennedy, Jim Metzger, and Stacy Frankovich, will review those pitches, suggest what they liked, what they didn't like. This has historically been invaluable to teams. We've had teams say thank you for that feedback, especially for early stage companies. This is hard feedback to get, and to have 4 folks like this from all different walks of our industry feeding back on that, really invaluable. I've often asked for follow-up afterwards. So send those pitch decks in. We're looking forward to hearing from you in those. And that brings us to our main event today. For the last 3 weeks, we have been talking about the answer to the question, how do I get a 510K? On October 29th, we talked about, how do I know if a 510K is right for me? Obviously, not every medical device will be cleared through a 510K. Some are de novos, some are PMAs, some are class 1 and exempt from the 510K process. Some, like we talked a minute ago, could be health and wellness, although there are limits to that kind of a category. If you want to see that episode, you can go back onto YouTube or through our website and find that show if you want to know if a 510K is right for your technology and your company. On November 5th, we talked about what goes into a 510K. And if you made it through that show, congratulations. It was probably the driest one we've done in ages, because we were talking about the statutory requirements for a 510K. Wasn't the most fun, but it's necessary understanding to be able to start to put one together. Last week on November 12th, we were joined by Adrienne Harris, our Director of Regulatory Affairs, who talked about how do I actually prepare for a 510K? What goes into it? How do I set up my file folder structure? What sorts of things am I looking for in the data that I put into those folders, and so forth? You can find all these episodes on YouTube. You can find them through our website. And today we're talking about what happens after I file. And before I welcome my guests on, I just want to remind you, what is a 510K? It's a pre-market submission. That means you've got to do it before you go to market, made to the FDA, to demonstrate that the device to be marketed is as safe and effective, that's the word substantially equivalent, as a legally marketed predicate device. Doesn't have to be identical, but it does have to be as safe and effective, and that's something that you need to demonstrate to the agency. You know that it's applicable to you. Well, in general, it is, unless you have to go through a PMA or unless you're exempt. And we talked over previous weeks about the kinds of things you need before you can set out to submit a 510K: classification and understanding of your predicate device, final draft labeling, specifications, performance data, sterilization information, guidance documents. But none of these are sufficient in and of themselves to be ready to submit. You have to take these and let them feed into your development and into your testing and into your clearance. You have to generate a mature design history file that can feed into that submission when it actually comes time to put it together. And last week we covered the 20 sections plus table of contents and checklist and the appendices that actually go into a 510K submission. So this week we're talking about what happens after I file. And here to talk about it with me, Adrian Harris and Rick Routson from our team. Welcome, guys. Nice to have you.
Great.
So this time around, we are digging into what happens after I file. And I fear that there's enough companies out there that think to themselves, I did it. I made it. I had this thing on my timeline. I was talking to my management. I was talking to my investors. And we were all looking towards this milestone. We got that thing out the door. I mean, and you know, with clients, we've taken pictures when we stuck that thing in the FedEx drop box. And it's like, yes, we hit the milestone. It is an important milestone. But this is not the end of the road by any stretch of the imagination.
Not at all.
When we're sitting there, we're going, yeah, okay, I know what's coming up next. Before we talk, I guess, about the details of what kinds of things we can expect when we hear back from FDA, there are some things that are going to happen that are kind of run-of-the-mill. They're just part of the process. The first one of those I actually want to bring up on the screen here, and it's a new thing. Adrian, I'd love it if you'd tell us just a little bit about it. We have a tracker that FDA is doing that's out of beta, out of pilots.
Out of the pilot program. From what I can tell, they now are offering this to every submission that comes in. Whoever is identified as the official correspondent currently will get an invite to be able to create a login and go here. It's not offered company-wide. Only one person from the team can have access to it. But it's really nice. You no longer are just sitting in a black hole wondering where your submission is at and what's going to happen, and feeling that question from management every 2 to 3 hours. Where is your submission
Have we heard
right
from
now?
FDA? Have we heard from FDA?
So it starts out with they notify you that they've received your submission. As you can see, this one, as an example, shows they confirmed the e-copy, they confirmed the user fee payment, they accepted the material you supplied. So all these things are saying you've made it past another gate, you made it past another gate. And then in this one, you can also see we placed the review on hold to ask you formally for more information. And then we received your more information. And we're going to jump to the ultimate end goal where it says cleared at the end, which is really when you break open the champagne and have a solid party.
That's the money. That's when the real party comes. We talked also about this refuse to accept checklist. Although there's something that happens even before that. FDA can come back to you, and if you haven't paid your money, they can say, "Hold up, we're just pausing this thing here." But then we get this sort of this magic letter that starts the process. Rick, we're getting back a letter from FDA, and what are they telling us? What's the very first thing that they tell us?
That they have received, and you get that letter that says they've received it, and it's now going into the, if you've met all of the criteria for refuse to acceptance, that's now going into substantive review by the review team at FDA, And what's not in there is please be patient while we go through this necessary
I love
process,
it.
which is at least that's how you should read it, because you need to be patient.
This is the time to get ready to be patient. I love that. Yeah, it would be nice if they put that in there. It was interesting. One time we talked to FDA during an on-site visit where they came to learn from us, and we had made a suggestion. It wasn't that one, but it was something similar. Like, it would really be cool for a lot of these startups if you would put this kind of information in. And they said, well, we wouldn't want to insult them because, of course, they work with a lot of big companies too who understand the process more clearly. But we went, this actually wouldn't insult them if you would just tell them, okay, get ready for this. So that's a good point. When we get an acknowledgement letter, we get a K number back. What's the deal with the K number here, Adrian?
Well, it's pre-submission for a 510K. So if you are submitting one, I'm going to assume you know what a K number is at this point, because if you've identified your predicates properly, you've used their K numbers for their pre-market notification or 510K clearance. But you get that K number with the initial acknowledgement letter. So at the end of the road, that is the 510K number that will be yours if you get cleared. And if you don't, that K number is just out the window. It's done. What you do need to know, and it says very clearly in the letter, is any future interactions based on that submission need to have that K number in there so they can keep track of things. So letterheads, cover letters, footers, headers, make sure that K number is always referenced going forward with any interaction.
That's a good point. Good point. Well, we talked about the RTA, the refuse to accept checklist that Rick mentioned a second ago. And of course, this is kind of let's make sure we've got all the basics done. If you really go into substantive review, Rick, like you said, we actually are at this point where we're waiting on the agency. And the thing we're going to pop up here is, if we can get the technology to work, which is always a question. We've got the chess clock, and as we were talking as a group, this is probably the best analogy for what you're up against. And it's a two-sided clock, right? This is a clock that's not just on you, it's not just on the agency. And if they send back, like Rick said, and we're going into substantive review, it's on them, right? Their clock is running. What are the sorts of things that's going on under the hood at FDA at this point?
Well, I think they're going through your documentation. They're trying to, if you haven't gone through the pre-sub process with them, this may be the first time they've even seen anything about your device.
That's a good point.
There's, that could be a whole conversation of whether or not to go through the pre-sub process with your device, but let's set that aside. So they're learning about it. They may have very brief questions of which they may just contact you through email. It could be a phone call. And this will be the primary correspondent. They may say, it'd be a very simple question, not one that stops the clock on their part, but it's we're kind of stuck here, we're not sure, can you just help us so that we can continue? And of course, being on that other end, you need to respond to them immediately. So the primary correspondent should be checking their emails every day to see if and all their voicemails to make sure that the FDA is not contacting them about questions that could be simply answered in 5 or 10 minutes with a phone call or a quick email. But they're going through determining what the device is, what it does, and they're going through and evaluating really your claim at the end that your device is substantially equivalent. So that takes into account all of those sections of work which you talked about last week, and they're looking at test reports. Certain ones will be of more interest than others depending on your device. They'll be looking at your test summaries. Did you perform the test correctly? Did you have deviations to your protocol that were justified? Did you have correct sample size, appropriate sample size? Looking through and compiling questions that could ultimately come back in a request for additional information.
Yeah, that's a good point. I love your point that if you haven't done any prior interactions, this could be their first view. So now you're getting judged on this thing that you put together, which they don't know this from any other of what did we say, 200 to 300 devices per month. So it's all in the quality of that submission that's getting reviewed. No, that's great. You mentioned that sometimes they'll reach back. There is a process also for interactive review that, like we said, doesn't stop the chess clock that we have up here. Um, and Rick, I think you covered it. It's like it's simple clarification. It's looking for little elements that they think might be missing that you can quickly address. But there is something that stops the clock. What is that?
So Rick said it already. It's a request for additional information or an additional information request, an AIR, which can also be considered a deficiency letter. So this is where they've gone through your whole submission and they have questions, and they think the questions really can't be answered over a quick phone call or an email. So that AIR does stop the clock. It puts it back into the sponsor's hands. You have 180 days to address that AIR. Now, for most startups, that is an unfathomable amount of time. So, as fast as you can address the things you want to. A couple important things to think of when you get this AIR. In the letter, they're very clear on what they're looking for, what they couldn't find, what they want. But they'll also offer you, like within 10 days, we can have a very quick meeting where you can ask us to clarify anything you don't understand. I always take that meeting. Even if you think you understand everything, it's just good to be like, hello, we're people, you're people, let's talk to each other. Always take an opportunity to interact with the agency. If there are bigger questions, again, in the letter it'll say, if you really don't know how to do this or we're really putting something out there, you can do a pre-sub, but this is a submission issue pre-sub where you're going to submit bigger questions or bigger interactions that you need to have to actually understand and answer what they're requesting more information for. If you get that pre-sub in within 60 days of that letter, they aim to turn it around in 21 days. So again, we're back to this clock thing. They have reasons that they need to meet timelines, so they're always really on it. I've always been impressed that they want to hit the timeline. Sometimes it feels like even more than I want them to hit the timeline. Like they really push for it. So within 21 days, they want to get back to you. If it's after that 60 days, it almost turns into just a normal pre-sub and they have 70 days to respond. But outside of that, I personally haven't had to use the submission issue request myself. If you have that initial phone call and you say, yep, I understand, we're going to go forward and we're going to try and make this happen. Because it's a request for additional information, it's not interactive. You have to do that e-copy thing again when you get your answers together. You have to put it into a file, put it in the mail, and then once they receive it, you'll get that next acknowledgement letter that they received that extra information from you.
That's a great rundown, Adrian. Thank you for that. We keep talking about these things that can turn back into a pre-sub, that can turn back into sort of these timelines that we're used to from the upfront part of it. Rick, this is a dilemma that startups face. Adrian, you referred to 180 days seems like a lifetime. Like we don't think of that in the startup world as a good thing to have 180 days. We want to get it done now. But this dilemma sometimes keeps coming back for the startups where I have opportunity to speak to the agency. I've got it right from the beginning. I mean, I could have not even a pre-submission. I could have an informational meeting with the agency, which we're not going to determine anything. But there's time that goes by on my own startup clock. Just describe this dilemma for us a little bit that we run into.
Well, often the AIR letter will have, one thing to point out is you won't get that when they hit the first issue and stop it immediately. They'll do the full review. And so it won't be them sending you, concerning an AIR concerning one topic, you answer back, then them issuing another one a month later with something completely different. It's a compilation.
It's a good point. They've gone through the whole thing. Yeah.
Yes. So often the items are, many of the items can be very quick to resolve, or are very straightforward. But the dilemma comes when there's requests for additional testing, especially user testing or any kind of long-term testing. And a lot of the tests, let's face it, that go into preparing this can easily take 3 to 6 months to arrange to actually run the test. A lot of these you're going to have if it's not a standard test, you have to develop a protocol, have that reviewed, perform the test, have your data analyzed, provide summaries. And so the dilemma comes that 180 days where your company is living on no income because your product is not on the market, but you'll need that full 180 days often to get some of those requests for additional information executed. Because it could easily take 6 months to perform this additional testing that you haven't thought about. And so dilemma comes in also where it's often of value to go through the pre-sub process ahead of time, and something the FDA encourages, so that if you have never talked with them about your test plan, if you never proposed a test plan and said, this is what we're going to test, and they see your device for the first time in a 510K submission, and they say, well, we think you should have done this kind of testing and this kind of user testing, and what about this testing? And if you've never had that interaction, now you have 180 days to get it all done, whereas if you'd gone through the pre-sub process, you'd had all that time prior to your submission, and then hopefully you've got it all covered at that point, and you don't get those. There's a whole new test that you didn't even plan on.
Yeah, that thing where you find the FDA is asking for something and you've been trying to say, no, we don't need it, but you better be aware that if they've been hinting at it, you're probably going to have to address it somehow. Yeah, that's really good. Well, so we got this additional information request. The hand goes down on the timer. The clock is stopped. It's back in my court. Adrian, like you said, I've got 180 days to respond to it. Rick, like you said, depending on my preparedness level, that may be a short or a long time, especially if FDA would like some interactive, they say, common thing is, we recommend that you submit a test protocol for review by us. Oh, wow, that's a lot of stuff to do. But what options do we have when we get this additional information request? I mean, we could just, as I think you alluded to, Adrian, we can have that 10-day clarification call a lot of the time. We could do a submission issue request. We could punt all the way back to a pre-sub. We've also got the option of just responding directly if we think we understand everything. I guess when would you say that just going back with a direct response versus having more of these discussions that we've been talking about, when does that make sense?
Well, if you have that meeting and you think you understand what they're looking for and it's pretty straightforward, do the work, compile the data, send it back to them. That's when it really does make sense. What I can say from a startup perspective, where you're gonna get hit the hardest and where you're gonna feel the pain of all the things you could have done before this moment in time. Startups, it's always time and money. They never have enough of either of those when it's a startup. So to Rick's point, if they come back and ask for a whole new slew of tests, you might not have devices. You might have built just the amount you had to build to run all your initial testing, and you did the testing, and you've got like maybe 5 or 6 back there on the shelf. Well, if they come back and ask for something that requires 20 devices in a test protocol, and you don't have them, now you have to build devices. If your product is sterile, you have to sterilize devices. So that again is adding to your timeline. So anything you can address immediately without extra testing, or rearrange or answer their questions. Oh, you had an issue with sample size, or you had an issue with the way we set this test up. Here's our justification for why it's okay. Here's a comparison to something else for how it was done and why we think ours is acceptable. Yeah, most of the time we want to avoid that extra testing.
It's such a great point, though, because I think each one of us has had that conversation with somebody where it's like, oh, how many of these do I need to test? Oh, I need 50 of them. Okay, I'm going to build 50. Well, first off, maybe you only end up with 48, and then you don't even have what you needed. But then these requests that come up, and man, if I just had another 20 of these, if I just had another 100 of these, it's always a good idea to build those devices more than you need them for that kind of testing.
One of the more painful ones, so you have a sterile product, and it has a use-by date. Now, use-by dates, I think we've talked about, it's the sterility, that the product can remain sterile until that date, but it's also the performance, right? So is after 3 years this thing sits on a shelf, is it still going to work the way it did on day one? Well, when you set up your test plan, you have to look at all the tests and say which one of these tests could be impacted by aging. And so I've seen this happen. They open up the reports and they go, you did this test on time equals 0 product. You did all your packaging testing over here. You've shown that the package is going to remain sterile for 1 year, 3 years, et cetera, but you didn't do performance testing on aged product. And that comes back. Now you need one, product, whether or not you have it. Two, it has to be aged. An accelerated aging protocol for 1 year is
About 20 days.
20 days.
Mm.
And so then you still have to redo that testing. So that's why going back to planning the test plans ahead of time and really thinking through your whole verification to make sure it supports what the device has to do is really important.
Suddenly 180 days isn't sounding like a whole lot if it turns out now I need sterile aged product
Or
to
you missed a
rerun any of
biocomp.
these tests.
You missed
Yeah.
a biocomp test. Those are easily 60 days, depending on which one you need, maybe more. So
The echo here is build more product than you need, than you think you need for your 510K, because you may have to go back and test it again.
and be confident in what you have to do. And sometimes that's talking to people more experienced than you, and some we'll just keep saying it, work with the agency. They want to work with you. So pre-subs.
Yeah. You know, we were going to go to the least burdensome flag next, and I want to talk about that in just a second. But I also want to talk about this idea of pedigree, which you brought up, and some of what I test in my device. Even if I think it's a finished device, it could need to go through the sterilization. It could need to go through aging. Has anything changed with respect to biocomp? Rick, give us a few words though about even before that, because it's so tempting when I have something in my hands to run out and test it and say, I did the test. But that's not always enough. There's more that needs to be documented here. There's more that needs to be known about what we have.
Yeah, so knowing the pedigree of your products and being able to identify what design level it was at, even what lot numbers you should be assigning lot numbers. You should be, it should be to a known design level. You should be able to look in the records and know everything about that part, when it was manufactured, what materials it was made of.
This is if we intend to submit it for a 510K, right? This is not my sandbox testing that I do early in development.
Right, and then another term that for these tests is use your worst case scenarios, which is what we've been talking about. Like with sterilization, there's ranges, and so you might need to look at the worst, highest end of sterilization it gets. Adrian's already alluded to the age factor, which obviously the older a part is and sits on the shelf, you can certainly justify why that's the worst case. So having all of that in mind and being able to document, okay, it was hopefully the latest design level, and if a part that you've tested has advanced in maturity in terms of the design's different, now you have to be able to justify that change from what you've tested is still valid to do that test. It's maybe you changed a small shape, part of the shape of the product in the tooling, but it really doesn't have, you might be able to justify that, well, that part doesn't even come into play, and so it's still okay that we've used that test, the same materials, same manufacturing processes. Where you get in trouble is if the FDA is looking and notices that you haven't documented your part pedigree level, design level, or they're different and they can't read justifications, or they can't find their justifications for that. And so you should always know your parts as you have them on your shelves, and keep them labeled, keep them segregated. Don't let them loose and just pick up any part, because that can come back to haunt you. And basically, you're just wasting the money on the test if it's scrutinized at all. If you can't properly identify what was tested.
What was tested there? Yeah, it's a really important point. I think a lot of times startups have this feeling like, I just got to make it through this testing and then I can submit, and then this will all be over. And I think what we're trying to draw attention to here is the fact that no, you may well get called upon on short notice to do more testing. You better know what those parts were. You better know how they were conditioned, what they were up against, so that you can report on something that's going to be credible. We're not talking about your early stage development, right? We're not talking about what you did on the bench early on to try to prove something to yourself. We're not talking about all this documentation for that. But when it's time to submit that 510K, those chops have got to be there. You've got to be doing it.
I know we said in our last iteration of this that we're assuming people understood design controls. You have a DHF built up, that you've gone through that whole process. One section of that 820.30 is called design change
Yeah,
control.
good.
And implementing that, if you implement it the way the regulation states, it's that once you've put a mark in the sand, this is my device, changes are going to happen. Hundreds of changes could happen. You know, everyone, I love the term design freeze. We reported to the board with management.
Never use the term design
We
freeze.
froze the design. So after that, it's only going to change about 100 more times. Some of them might be little, some of them might be big. You do have to stop, you know, you do have to say, here's the one we're going to start with. But if you follow the design control process and you follow it properly, in there it says, when I make a change, I have to document what changed, and then I have to justify the change. And part of that justification is looking at, have I done anything official with this version? And will I have to redo it? If it's a material change and you've already done biocompatibility, that could be timely and expensive unless you have a way to justify that that material doesn't impact biocompatibility. So once you're in that change control process, that's going to give you all of that pedigree you need to be able to point to justify things going forward. If you skip over doing that and you're not in design controls, it gets way harder to find what you did and why you did it. And you think you'll always remember when you're doing it, but you don't.
And the email doesn't count. I guess it's lesson 2 today also. No such thing as design freeze. And that's actually true. We won't belabor it, but that's actually true. Even if you really do intend to freeze it, because things will change. Parts will become unavailable. Manufacturers will change. All sorts of things will happen. So those are great points. Let's recap a little bit here. Before, in a minute, I want to talk about things that lead to harder additional information requests, right? But let's recap here. So we've sent this thing to FDA. We've sent our 510K in. They've gone through some of the procedural stuff. They've given us a K number. They've told us, yay, we got it. You didn't do anything too dumb. We made it through the refuse to accept checklist. Now we've got this additional information request back. Oh, we also said there is an interactive review that doesn't stop the clock. Rick described that a little bit, that sometimes we're able to have a back and forth with the agency. I think you had said earlier, Adrian, it's kind of if they think they can get to clearance without too much more information, they're willing to not stop the
Still
clock.
within the time window.
Yeah,
So
okay.
I thought we had the timeline that we were going to put up, but that, you know, that first substantive review is 60 days. And they might ask you questions before that, but they have 60 days to dig into your submission and compile all the questions they think they can come up with. And they really try and hit that. 90 days is when they want to say you're either substantially equivalent or not substantially equivalent. And so it's that 30-day time window on their end, which is where the clock is going to stop and put it back on you. And if they think, I have an easy question, I'm going to ask it, they can answer it, and it's not going to eat up that extra 30 days on their side, they'll email you, they'll call you, but it's the bigger stuff that they want to pause and say, we won't get to 90 days if you guys can't answer all this.
So you should feel pretty good if you're getting an interactive review.
Very
It
good.
means that they're feeling pretty good about getting you through on this one. That's great. There's one more tool at our disposal, right? If we feel like this is just not reasonable, if the statutory requirements are not being met on FDA's side, there is out of pilot, there's a least burdensome flag that we can throw. Either one of you want to give us a quick summary of that?
I'm being looked at. If, and I wouldn't advise without some experienced regulatory consultants helping you. If you feel that the FDA is asking you for information that is above and beyond what your predicate had to perform or supply with their submission, if you're being asked for things beyond your intended use, your stated intended use, and that can happen, and you know, then there is this the least burdensome flag, which tool at your disposal, where you can say procedurally, we believe that you are asking something of us that was above and beyond what this predicate had to do. It's beyond the scope of what we should have to provide and demonstrate to you for substantial equivalence. And at that point, that goes to FDA and higher levels than your reviewers, supervisors, and the department head. That would get reviewed up the chain to see if that is, if they agree. The the limited experience that I've had in it was often, it's probably not likely that the tides will turn back in your favor. Often, you can't expect that the supervisors and the department heads may be informed along the way, and the lead reviewer might be consulting with them ahead of time to say, hey, we're feeling like this is really needed. And so it's out there. I have no idea what the percentage of the success rate of it is. I wouldn't count on it, but there certainly could be something that is truly above and beyond what they should be asking, and that tool properly used may save you as a company a lot of work, and may eventually result in you getting your 510K sooner than having to stop everything and possibly have to do a new 510K 2 years down the road because it's going to take that long to do what they ask.
Yeah, it's a good summary, and also worth saying that least burdensome flag, it does go on the record, right? So even if it does come to that, it's something that you can register your complaint there. Well, let's go to this question. We've got maybe about 10 minutes left here. I also want to check and see if we have any questions coming up.
There was one point I also wanted to
Yeah,
make.
please, Rick.
We've been talking about a lot of bad news with this, but one thing that startups often don't realize is once you get the AIR letter and you're able to fill it all out, you're not rewriting your 510K at this point.
Yep.
They may say, we want you to make this change to Section 5, your substantial or your product summary, or some section of it. At that point, as the startup, you don't have to recompile your whole 510K and update everything and all the work that went into it. At that point, you're taking whatever part of the 510K that you've been asked to revise or redo, and you're just doing that. Now, there might be 3 or 4 sections ultimately, so you might be supplying, but you're not recompiling a whole new 510K version for them. So for whatever, that is a bit of good news and saves a little bit of work at the end.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. They're coming back on specific sections and they're making specific requests. Some of those specific requests that I think we had listed when we were chatting about this before as ones that lead to harder requests, right? And you both alluded to, sometimes they'll come back and they'll just say, hey, we just need you to change this. And if you're okay with that, make the change and get your 510K, right? It's like at some level when it's that kind of a question.
But sometimes that type of question impacts the business as a whole. So it can be, if they say, we use the example of peds in adults.
Yeah.
So they say, we see all the data that completely supports an adult indication. We don't think you have the data to support the peds indication. Give us the data to support that. Or you could change your indications for use and make it just for adults. And that becomes a very company-wide, you're going to have to go all the way up the flagpole to be like, can we as a company, if this product, a minimum viable product comes out on the market that only has the adult indication, are we going to float? Are we going to float long enough to, let's get an adult version out, and then we can work on a 510K for a pediatric version and support that? Or, one thing we didn't cover was, you can get that AIR and go, we're out. And you just withdraw the submission. We can't answer these questions in a timely fashion. We're not going to be able to answer it, and pull it back again. So there are some times where it's not so much get the testing done or find the data that they need. It's, can I shift the actual concept of the product? Because if my data supports a certain claim set and I want a different claim set, sometimes you just ask them, if I make it this, will it go? And they'll go, yeah, you have the data to support that. So that sometimes is also an option, and that it's a company-wide thing to really think about when you're a small company.
I'm glad you brought that up, because that takes us right back to the very reason that FDA is there in the first place, which is, we've often said, is they're not primarily a technology regulation organization. They're primarily a marketing claims regulation organization. That easy change that, just change your labeling this way. Well, but if that eliminates the entire market that I thought I was going for, maybe that's not an easy change. That's a great point. We'd had a little list here. I'm going to go through this list rather quickly so we can talk a little bit about the type of requests themselves. we had said that things that lead to harder additional information requests, failure to review your test plan with the agency in a pre-sub ahead of time, failure to address all prior FDA asks, submission of incomplete or erroneous testing that doesn't line up with what you're trying to say, lack of clarity on what the device actually is, because like we talked before, they're seeing 200, 300 of these a month, and you better be really clear about what your device is if they haven't seen it before. Justification's a huge part. Did you really succeed at justifying, Rick, like you said, the substantial equivalence argument that's the basis of the entire submission itself? And then simple errors, like just simple clerical errors, can really reduce confidence on the part of the agency. So these are things that you can do to try to make sure it's clean before it goes in. But in the last few minutes that we have, I want to talk with you guys about the typical AI requests. And we broke these down into a few areas: labeling, testing and data, and then sort of non-technical things. Adrian, tell us just a bit about labeling. What are some typical labeling asks that the FDA might make?
You have instructions for use. They might say they're not clear, or there's sections that aren't clear, or there's sections that aren't supported by your data. And those ones are oftentimes easy to address. We're going to do exactly what you say. We're going to go update our instructions for use and take care of that. Let's say you put it's DEHP free, but you don't have DEHP free testing to support it. You looked at all your materials and you said, well, all our materials are DEHP free, but they go, no, we wanted to see actual testing to say that it does not contain DEHP, or latex example. You now have the decision to pull that symbol and pull that concept out of your labeling, or find the testing to support it. And those, again, are just what I would consider easy ones, as long as it's not impacting your market entry.
Yeah, but this brings up the dilemma again. A labeling change, am I okay with it? And does it cut right at the heart of what my business was about? Or is it kind of we can do that. That's great. From the standpoint of testing and data, we already talked about this idea of how many times has the FDA said, we recommend that you submit a detailed protocol for evaluation. But Rick, there's this thing that I know we've seen a number of times where FDA pushes back, and they push back on something that's clinical. And they say, we just think clinically, you're wrong, basically, to the company. I know we've often seen traction when you bring your own firepower to the table.
Right. A great point. The reviewer and the review team isn't necessarily an expert in the clinical field that your device is aimed at. So hopefully through the process, you have clinical experts that are guiding you along with the development of this device. And it's not necessarily a matter of it's certainly not a matter of the FDA just trying to be difficult. They just may not understand clinically. They may not have the depth of knowledge that you and your team have regarding the clinical relevance and the clinical effects of this device. And so you are able, in some of these reviews, you are able to bring along a clinical expert. And usually good to have a prepared written statement that they can read ahead of time, and justifying some of those questions. So often it's informing and teaching the review team about your specific clinical use or why your device is clinically relevant, because nobody's an expert on anything. And yet these FDA teams are basically trying, these review teams that's their job, to clear all medical devices. And so yes, they're in smaller branches and areas, but they don't always have the same understanding that you do.
Go ahead. Yeah.
I was going to say, one other point that I was thinking about was that in the substantial equivalence, you may talk about it's safe and effective, but the other part of that is, and brings no new issues of
no new technical
safety because of technical differences. And that can be something that might be easy to neglect to really document well within your submission. And so you could have good test results say, yes, this is, at the end result is the same, but have you covered all those, through a risk analysis? Have you done a careful and thorough risk analysis to really preemptively be able to answer those questions?
That's a great point, going right back to the statutory definition of substantial equivalence. Yeah, if it's the same intended use and the same technology, great, but the minute that technology brings up new questions of safety or efficacy.
Because
yeah.
most of the time, the startups, you're bringing a novel way to do things. So you're not mimicking something. It's hard to find a predicate that does exactly what your device does, especially if you have a novel way of doing things. No one's done it before you, so that's the case that you have to successfully bring to the FDA is, yes, I have a different device, but it's meeting both those criteria.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, Rick. That's a wonderful point. I want to take just a moment and say if there's anyone who has a question, feel free to type it in the Q&A, put it in the chat. We've got just a few minutes left, and we'd love to address your question if there is any live here today. So feel free to stick that in. And actually, we do have one hand raised here. I'm going to get Ken's question, and then I want to touch on one more topic here. But Ken, you're live, and we don't have a speaker in the room, so I'm gonna have you say it to me, and then I'll repeat it to our panel here.
Okay, so my question is, I have several actually, but one is EUA to 510K. So the EUAs that have been, I don't want to say awarded, but the EUAs have been approved for COVID-19. I mean, the pandemic is still there. Is there any time frame on how long an EUA is valid for, or is it just until the CDC says the pandemic is over?
Yeah, so great question from Ken asking. The EUAs are out there. How long are these good for, right? How long do they last before they go away, and then the only option we have is a 510K? And Ken, I guess I'll start by saying that the EUA is good for the duration of the public health emergency, and that's something that the government could pull at any time. I think they've been hinting at things. They've tended with masks and other things to hint and to pull slowly, but it really is something that's completely dependent on that. Anything that either of you would add to that? Or that relationship between the EUA and how do I bridge between that and my 510K?
Well, what's great is that if you've gotten an EUA, you've had extensive interaction with the agency, and you've had extensive interaction around the product that you got an EUA for that is now on the market. So, though, I would almost say that as soon as you can support that EUA as a company, you start preparing a 510K, if you know it's a 510K product. But at the end of the day, you now have data, real world data. You had enough data to support the EUA. You've had interactions with the agency of what they want to see. There's possibly you've now had an interaction of, well, if you want to go to market when you're done with this through the normal pathway, we're going to need a little bit more of this, this, and this. So I'd actually see that as a really great foundation for moving forward with a 510K. But you don't want to be caught with, they pull the EUA and now you have to stop selling because you don't have your 510K ready. So stay ahead of that.
Yeah, that's great. Ken, you had another really quick question. We're running low on time, but I want to make sure we get your other question.
So you actually alluded to it. So the FDA pulled EUAs for PPEs some time ago, and actually didn't tell a lot of people, right? So, so one of the things that we got stuck with at Michigan was that we had a negative pressure helmet. Now we did get an EUA for the negative pressure tent. They described the negative pressure helmet as a PPE, and we were stuck in limbo there. We heard nothing back. So can you go back and ask that they should reconsider this as an EUA? Because it's really a totally different animal than PPE. Is there any way to do that?
So the question had to do again with EUAs and whether, as these things get pulled and you sort of are running out of options, can you take these? If I've got this right, Ken, can you take it back and ask them to reconsider something as an EUA, even though the PPE EUAs keep getting rescinded in various ways. I think maybe the thing to say, and this is something we could talk about offline more too, because we've got one more thing to say about the 510Ks here, is EUAs are often available on a one-off basis, right? We're familiar with the masks and things like that we've talked about ad infinitum, but it is possible to get an EUA for a device that's standalone. So I think if an EUA pathway is one that's desirable as opposed to a 510K to still be useful for the current pandemic, those you don't need an overarching blanket EUA category. You can pursue those individually. So, we could probably dive into that more offline, but that is certainly an option. Thanks for those questions, Ken. I want to read this as a final comment and then open it up to our esteemed panelists here for their final statements. I got from a friend who's quite a expert herself in this area. She gave me their timeline for a recent 510K. 1,000 pages submitted. 2 weeks later, they had to make a correction because they noticed something in their submission that needed to be fixed. A month and a half later, they got their additional information request. Remember, this is all a 90-day timeline in theory, right? And so, of course, what's being illustrated here, it's not really a 90-day timeline. They had the 10-day conference call. Now we're a solid 2.5 months to 3 months beyond the submission itself. Submission issue request happens. Written feedback happens. Now we are basically 1, 2, 3, and some days, 3 months and some days beyond the submission. Additional information request beyond that. Deficiency review beyond that. Interactive review beyond that. Still expecting labeling changes, still expecting a clearance. That clearance 6 months, not 3 months at all. Seem about right?
Very standard.
Very standard, yeah. I think that's the thing for everyone to understand and recognize is you're not done when you submit that 510K. It's a nominally 90-day process after that, but it's one that requires a lot of back and forth. If it's interactive, that's good news. If it's a written response, get ready to do that work that's under the hood. As we close this show up, any last thoughts from either of you, Rick, Adrian?
One thing that, as we were speaking earlier in the week, is that as a startup, you're going in with no credibility. This is the first time you've gone in. You're not submitting 510K submissions a year where you've gotten to know the review teams over time. You've learned what they want. So the more time, it's kind of a two-edged sword because upper management's looking at it like, you got to get this 510K and you got to get the submission in. But you see where these instances where if you go in, you get it in as quick as you can, you haven't really vetted it as well as you could have, and you go in without the credibility, what you have put in is going to be scrutinized even more, and they're going to find the things that you missed. And the timeline to receiving 510K clearance could be a lot longer if you rush to failure. That was a term that we were using with one of our clients, and they didn't want to rush to failure and get things in too quick. And so it's that fine line of making sure you're ready, because it can save you a lot of those multiple AIR letters, multiple interactive reviews, going through taking the time to do pre-subs ahead of time so that they've had a chance, the FDA's had a chance to tell you what they're going to want to see in testing, and you've had time to make enough product to be able to run all that through the aging, which takes time, accelerated aging in the biocomp tests. And so it's a tough challenge to figure out. Yes, you got to get it in quick, but not too quick where you're not ready.
Not only have they not seen your product before, they probably, if you're a startup, haven't seen your company before, and you've got to build that credibility. Adrian, last word.
You get the substantial equivalence letter. Yay.
Yay!
We're done. You're so far from done. You just started. I hate to do that to people. So what that means is your design, your device design, the device design has been found substantially equivalent to a predicate. You can now market it commercially. However, that's on paper. If you have a commodity product where, let's say, you need to make 10,000 or 100,000 of them per year to actually support the market, you may be made 100 to support that testing. You don't know if you can make 100,000. You don't know if you make 100,000 that are good. So there's now this big production ramp up. And sometimes you can get some of it done ahead of time. Sometimes you can't. It really depends on the type of product and the type of company that you are. But you get that clearance letter, and now it means you're allowed to figure out how to build it. And we get into process controls and production controls, and maybe you did a batch validation for your sterilization where you sterilized one lot and you knew it was sterile, but now if you're going to have to kick lots out every 3 months, you need to do an actual validation. So colloquially, 510K is halfway. Whether that's time or money or neither, basically what we're saying is you've made it to the top of Mount Everest, and you get to put that flag in, but people still die coming down it. So you still have to climb down, and that climb down can be nearly as arduous as the climb up. So
Yeah,
know
that's a
that you're
great
not
point.
done.
That's a great point. And maybe there should have been a 5-week series, because that's another important thing for us to talk about at some point, is what happens after the 510K to really get product out there that's working and that's good. And why are we talking about all this? We don't want you to go in blind if you're a startup, if you're an innovator, if you're an experienced company where you're part of a team that's not done this before. We don't want you going in blind. None of this is to make light of it or to say that these timelines don't matter. They do. And that's why we're talking about this, so that you can understand where some of the hiccups are, where some of the pitfalls are, and so you don't oversimplify the process, but address it in a credible, competent way. So with that, I just want to thank Adrienne, Rick, thank you both for being here and talking about this great expertise. Thank you all for being here with us today. Hope that you've enjoyed this 4-week series. I'm going to give just a minute for any announcements or statements from anybody about what's happening in the community. We'll take just an extra minute for that if anyone has any of those or any questions based on anything that's happened on the show. Otherwise, look forward to seeing you next. Well, actually, I'm sorry, I almost messed it up, because today is an announcement that next Friday is the day after Thanksgiving. There will not be a show the day after Thanksgiving. Hope you are on vacation. Hope you are spending time in a safe way with your family, that you'll get to enjoy that. We're coming up to this holiday season. Hope you make good use of that. We will see you back here in December. And in December, we're going to start making some cool announcements about what's happening in 2022. Some really cool changes coming to MedTech Crossroads. We'll still be here every Friday at 2. But in terms of the format, in terms of the structure, and some cool things that you can come to expect with a little bit more knowledge of what's coming down the road, we'll be talking about that in December. So I want to thank you for being here. Have a wonderful Thanksgiving. Thanks for being with us on MedTech Crossroads. Bye-bye.